Somewhere in your kitchen right now, food is rotting, while a 3,000-year-old Native American technique could keep that same food fresh until next year. The FDA won't tell you about this. Grocery stores definitely don't want you knowing. But one overlooked ingredient changes absolutely everything about how long food actually lasts. Let's start with something your great-grandmother probably knew, but your grocery store hopes you've forgotten. Sun-drying meat. Native American tribes turned fresh buffalo, deer, and elk into jerky that lasted years. Not weeks, years. And the process was stupidly simple. They sliced the meat thin, about a 1/4 inch, and hung those strips on wooden racks under the blazing sun. No fancy equipment, no electricity, just patience and hot weather. Here's where it gets interesting. When you drop the water content in meat below 15%, bacteria basically pack their bags and leave. They can't grow, they can't multiply, they're done. It's like evicting tiny tenants by making the apartment too dry to live in. A single buffalo could produce over 50 pounds of dry jerky. One animal, 50 pounds. That's enough protein to feed a family through an entire brutal winter. And get this, that jerky weighed roughly 1/5 of the original fresh meat. So when tribes migrated hundreds of miles, they weren't hauling around a buffalo's worth of weight. They carried concentrated nutrition in lightweight bundles. But they didn't stop there. Some tribes burned wild sage or juniper near the drying racks. Why? The smoke kept insects away. Flies hate that stuff. It's like nature's bug spray, except it actually works and doesn't cost $12 at the hardware store. Now, properly dried jerky stored in rawhide bags, 2 to 3 years of shelf life. No refrigerator, no preservatives you can't pronounce. Just dried meat sitting in a bag, perfectly safe to eat. Makes you wonder what else we've overcomplicated, right? But jerky was just the starting point. Tribes took this dried meat and transformed it into something even more powerful, a food so energy-dense that European explorers literally fought wars over it. Pemmican. If jerky was the foundation, pemmican was the skyscraper built on top of it. Here's how it worked. Take that bone-dry jerky and pound it into powder. Not chunks, powder. Then mix it with rendered animal fat, the kind you get from boiling down buffalo bones until the grease floats to the top. Some tribes threw in dried berries like chokecherries or saskatoons. Now, you've got something special. The fat created an airtight seal around every tiny meat particle. Moisture couldn't get in. Air couldn't get in. Bacteria looked at this stuff and basically said, "We give up." And those berries? They weren't just for flavor. They packed vitamin C, which meant no scurvy. Pretty clever for people without chemistry degrees. 1 pound of pemmican delivered over 3,500 calories. Let that sink in. 3,500 calories in something that fits in your pocket. Your average granola bar gives you maybe 200. You'd need to carry 17 granola bars to match 1 pound of pemmican. European fur traders discovered this and lost their minds. Suddenly, expeditions that would have required wagon loads of food could travel light and fast. The Hudson's Bay Company built their entire business model around pemmican. I'm not exaggerating. They literally established trading posts specifically to acquire this stuff from tribes. The mixture got packed into buffalo intestine casings or rawhide containers called parfleches. Sounds gross. Worked perfectly. And here's what really gets me. Pemmican stored in cool, dry conditions, documented cases of it staying perfectly edible for over 10 years. A decade, no freezer, no canning equipment, just meat, fat, and berries doing their thing. But concentrated calories were only half the survival equation. Tribes needed variety, especially protein from rivers teeming with fish. Now let's head to the Pacific Northwest, where rivers ran so thick with salmon you could practically walk across their backs. Tribes there built smokehouses, nothing fancy, just wooden structures with fires burning low underneath. Alderwood was the fuel of choice. Why alder? It burns slow, produces tons of smoke, and gives the fish this subtle sweetness that hickory just can't match. Here's where the science gets interesting. Smoke isn't just flavor. It's loaded with phenols and formaldehyde compounds. Yeah, formaldehyde. The same stuff in laboratories. These chemicals land on the fish surface and basically tell bacteria to take a hike. They also form this thin protective coating that seals everything in. One salmon hanging in a smokehouse, nice dinner. 500 salmon, that's survival. And that's exactly what families processed during autumn runs. Sometimes 1,000 fish. I can barely manage grilling 4 burgers without burning one, and these folks were preserving enough protein to last until spring. The process took weeks, not hours, weeks. Low heat slowly cooked the proteins while smoke worked its way deep into every fiber of flesh. Rush it, and you get mushy fish that rots in a month. Do it right, and you've got food that travels. But storage mattered just as much as smoking. Finished salmon got wrapped in cedar bark, which has its own natural antimicrobial properties, by the way, and placed into cool storage pits dug into the earth. 6 months later, still perfectly edible, some families ate smoked salmon from September clear through March without a single piece going bad. Pretty remarkable when you consider we panic if our freezer loses power for an afternoon. Speaking of underground storage, tribes across the continent discovered something even more surprising about holes in the ground. Holes in the ground. That's it. That's the technology. Sounds primitive until you realize these pits outperformed most root cellars Europeans built centuries later. Here's what tribes figured out. Dig down 4 to 6 feet and something magical happens. Temperature stops swinging. Summer heat, doesn't matter. Winter freeze, also doesn't matter. Down there, it hovers around 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. The Mandan people along the Missouri River turned this into an art form. They dug bell-shaped pits, narrow at the top, wide at the bottom. Smart design. That small opening meant less air exchange, fewer critters sneaking in, and easier sealing. Each pit held roughly 20 bushels of corn. That's about 500 pounds of food in a single hole. And these folks had multiple pits per household. We stress about pantry organization while they were running underground warehouse operations. But the real genius was in the layering. Wild turnips, camas bulbs, Jerusalem artichokes. They didn't just dump everything together. Dry grass went between each layer. Why? Insulation, air circulation, moisture control. 3 problems solved with dead plants. I once lost an entire bag of potatoes because I forgot them in a dark cabinet for 2 months. These people kept root vegetables fresh for half a year using literal dirt and grass. The pit openings got sealed tight with flat rocks, then packed with earth on top. Rodents? Blocked. Rain? Deflected. Temperature swings? Eliminated. Some cache pits were hidden so cleverly that archaeologists still stumble across sealed stores today. Centuries-old food stashes that families never retrieved. Maybe they moved. Maybe something happened. The pits just kept doing their job regardless. Now, if buried pits seem impressive, wait until you hear what northern tribes did with permanently frozen ground. Permafrost. Basically a giant freezer that never needs electricity because it never stops being frozen. Northern tribes figured this out thousands of years ago. Why build cold storage when the ground itself stays below 20 degrees Fahrenheit permanently? The Inuit dug ice cellars straight into frozen earth. Some reached 10 feet deep. At that depth, summer couldn't touch the cold. These weren't simple holes either. They carved out actual rooms down there. Storage chambers that held enough caribou, seal, and fish to feed entire villages through the darkest months. Here's what surprised me when I learned this. Meat frozen in extreme Arctic cold actually keeps better than the stuff in your grocery store freezer. Why? Speed. When food freezes slowly, large ice crystals form inside cells and rupture the tissue. That's why thawed supermarket chicken sometimes has that mushy texture. But flash freezing in negative 40-degree winds? Tiny crystals. Minimal damage. Better flavor when it thaws. Nature invented flash freezing before we did. We just gave it a fancy name. The timing required precision, though. Food had to go underground before brief summer warmth softened the top layer of soil. Miss that window and you're gambling with your winter supply. Location mattered too. North-facing slopes stayed coldest longest. Experienced hunters knew exactly which spots held their freeze best. That knowledge passed down through generations like a family recipe. Except this recipe kept people alive. And the maintenance required? Zero. No power bills. No compressor repairs. No crying when the electricity goes out during a storm. Just dig, store, seal, and trust the earth to do its job. But freezing wasn't the only hands-off preservation method. Some tribes discovered that certain minerals pulled straight from the ground could keep meat safe for a full year. Salt. The white gold that tribes would walk 100 miles to get their hands on. And I mean that literally. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest made annual pilgrimages over 100 miles to reach sacred salt lakes. That's a serious hike for seasoning. But this wasn't about making food taste better. This was about keeping it from killing you. Here's the science that makes salt so ruthless against bacteria. When you pack salt onto raw meat, it pulls water straight out of the cells through osmosis. Remember that from high school? Water moves from areas of low salt concentration to high salt concentration. Your meat becomes a desert, and bacteria? They're basically tiny water balloons. Take away their water, they shrivel and die. Pretty harsh way to go, honestly, but effective. The process started with harvesting crystallized salt from mineral deposits and dried lake beds. Tribes would scrape up these precious white crystals and carry them back like they'd found treasure. Because they had. Then came the curing. Hunters rubbed generous amounts of salt into every surface of fish and game meat. Over time, a thick crust formed on the outside. This wasn't just drawing out moisture anymore. It created an actual physical barrier. Nothing could get in. No air, no contamination, no problems. Salt-cured venison stored in clay pots stayed safe to eat for an entire year. 12 months of preserved protein from one hunting trip. The value of this resource? Salt was traded as eagerly as tools or weapons. Sometimes more eagerly. You can make a new spear. You can't make salt without finding it first. But salt wasn't the only crop that practically preserved itself. Corn had its own tricks, and the methods were surprisingly clever. Corn. The crop that basically domesticated us while we thought we were domesticating it. Native farmers figured out something brilliant. Fresh corn rots in days. But dried corn? That stuff outlasts your grandparents' marriage. The technique started right after harvest. Women braided corn ears together by their husks, creating these long decorative chains. Looked pretty hanging from the rafters, but this wasn't interior decorating. It was survival engineering. Air circulated around every ear. Moisture escaped slowly over weeks. By the time those kernels turned rock hard, they dropped below 14% water content. Mold couldn't grow. Insects lost interest. Even mice had trouble gnawing through kernels that hard. But drying was just step one. Parching took things further. Dried kernels went into clay pots filled with hot sand. The heat puffed them slightly, turned them golden, and drove out even more moisture. Think of it like making popcorn's serious older brother. Less fun at parties, but way more useful. The Iroquois stored their parched corn in woven baskets lined with bark. 2 to 3 years of shelf life. No refrigeration, no plastic containers. Just smart design. Here's what gets me, though. 1 acre of cultivated corn produced enough dried kernels to feed a person for an entire year. A single acre. That's smaller than a football field keeping someone alive for 12 months. And the versatility? Incredible. Grind it into flour for bread, toss it in stews, or just carry it as trail food that needed zero cooking. Pop a handful in your mouth and keep walking. Corn was the ultimate prepper food before prepping was cool. But storing dry goods was only half the battle. Some tribes preserved things that seemed impossible to keep, like berries, and their method was surprisingly simple. Berries, nature's candy, also nature's cruelest joke because they rot faster than your excuses for skipping the gym. Fresh blueberries, maybe a week in your fridge. Wild service berries picked at noon. Mushy by dinner. Native tribes faced the same problem every summer when bushes exploded with fruit that wouldn't last. Their solution was beautifully simple. Mash everything. Spread it thin on flat rocks. Let the sun do its thing. Women gathered berries by the basketful and crushed them into paste. No fancy equipment, just hands and maybe a wooden pestle. The mashed fruit got spread across sun-heated stones in layers thinner than a playing card. Here's where it gets interesting. As water evaporated over several days, natural fruit sugars concentrated. What started as watery berry mush transformed into leathery sheets that tasted like candy. Sweet, chewy, portable candy. The Blackfoot actually called these things prairie candy. That name stuck for a reason. And the weight loss? Dramatic. A pound of fresh berries became a few ounces of dried fruit leather. Imagine carrying your entire winter vitamin supply in something lighter than a pair of socks. Storage was dead simple too. Roll the sheets up, fold them, toss them in woven baskets. Done. These berry cakes lasted through entire winters without turning into fuzzy science experiments. But the real magic happened at mealtime. Drop a piece into hot water or stew, and the berries basically came back to life. Not quite fresh, but close enough to taste summer in January. Pretty clever for people without sugar factories or preservative chemicals, right? Now, berries seem almost easy compared to what comes next. Because some tribes figured out how to make squash last half a year using nothing but fireplace leftovers. Wood ash. The stuff you sweep out of your fireplace and probably toss in the trash. Turns out that gray powder was practically a preservation miracle. Here's the deal. Squash has a problem. Great harvest in autumn, but those thick-skinned vegetables start rotting within weeks if you just leave them sitting around. Soft spots appear, mold creeps in. Before you know it, your winter food supply smells like a gym locker. Native farmers figured out something clever. Rub that squash down with plain old fireplace ash. Sounds almost too simple, doesn't it? But the science actually checks out. Wood ash is highly alkaline, which means fungal spores absolutely hate it. They can't get a foothold on that hostile surface. Meanwhile, the ash pulls moisture right out of the rind. Dry skin means slower decay. Simple as that. The Three Sisters tribes, the ones who grew corn, beans, and squash together, had this down to an art form. After harvest, women would coat each squash thoroughly and set them on raised wooden platforms. Airflow underneath prevented moisture from pooling. Smart design, zero technology required. And the results? 4 to 6 months of preservation. That's squash lasting from October clear through February or March, without a single chemical, without refrigeration, just burned wood remnants and some elevated storage. Now, I tried this myself last fall with some butternut squash. Coated 3 of them in ash from my wood stove. The neighbors definitely thought I'd lost my mind, but those squash outlasted everything else in my pantry by months. When cooking time came, just washed the ash off. The flesh inside stayed perfectly good. Tasted like it was harvested yesterday. Pretty impressive for garbage, right? But ash seems almost tame compared to what Arctic tribes did next. They buried meat in bags and actually wanted it to rot. All right, this next method might make your stomach flip. Fair warning, Inuit and Yupik peoples took fish heads, organs, or chunks of meat and stuffed them into sealskin bags. Then they buried those bags underground for months on purpose. They wanted the contents to ferment, to break down, to develop what polite people call an acquired smell. Everyone else calls it something unrepeatable. The result goes by names like stinkheads or stinkfish, depending on the region. And yes, it smells exactly like you'd expect buried fish heads to smell after sitting underground since summer. But here's what's actually happening inside those bags. Beneficial bacteria get to work on the proteins, pre-digesting everything before it even reaches your stomach. This makes nutrients way easier for your body to absorb. Clever, right? The fermentation also produces lactic acid naturally. That acid prevents the dangerous bacteria from moving in. Same principle behind yogurt and sauerkraut, just taken to an extreme most of us can't quite stomach. Now, why bother with something so intense? Arctic winters offer 0 fresh plants. None. No berries, no greens, no vitamin sources whatsoever. Fermented foods filled that gap, providing essential nutrients that prevented deficiency diseases. The tricky part was temperature control. Too warm and harmful bacteria took over, causing genuine food poisoning. Too cold and fermentation stopped entirely. The sweet spot required experience passed down through generations. My personal limit? I'll admit I've never tried this one. Some experiments stay theoretical, but these buried bags kept entire communities alive through months of frozen darkness. No electricity, no supplements, just ancestral knowledge and carefully controlled rot. So there you have it. 10 preservation methods that kept food safe for months, sometimes years. No refrigerator required, just observation, patience, and remarkable ingenuity.